Welcome everybody. My name is Phil Restino and I'm the coordinator for the Central Florida chapter of Veterans for Peace. And we are better known as the Colonel Bob Bowman Memorial Chapter of Veterans for Peace. And as many of you know, Bob Bowman maintained that in order to stop these wars, you've got to get to the lie that's being used to justify them, and that's the lie of 9/11, which we're going to hear much more about today with our guest speaker. I do want to say this is our first event in 2016. We're hoping to do more of these events. We're calling them the Questioning the U.S. War on Terror Project. And I want to first acknowledge some people who made this happen. I want to acknowledge the core group we have here in Daytona Beach of volunteers who have been our unsung heroes of getting the word out, making flyers, being on the corner, making signs. I've been in South Florida for the past couple of months, so I want to identify first a single individual, Jim Green, for taking charge in my absence of getting the crew together and to get the flyers made, to get folks out on the corner and get them distributed. We want to give Jim Green a nice hand, please. Secondly, Kathy and Brett Bracewell, 2/3 of Team Bracino. We've been together since late '04, and here we are in 2016 doing this. I mean, these two individuals, they're my better half. I don't, if you can figure the math out, that's. But thank you, Kathy Bracewell, her son Brett Bracewell. Usually we have our man Brian Schwapwitz back in the back, hitting the pavement and handing flyers out and getting in people's faces, but he's been down with the flu the past few weeks, and thankfully we've had Cheryl Taft step up and take his place and spend hours out on the street going into shops, handing out flyers and dealing with the library here. So we want to thank Cheryl. Brian Schlappitz in the back with the flute. and our friend Eric alongside him. Joel Fears, that's another one of our Daytona Beach activists. And Chris the Sign Man. Chris's Signs in New Smyrna Beach. And if I forgot anyone from our Daytona Beach core group, and a couple other people, Lou Welge, who's been very big on promoting all three of our events. Justin Harvey from the Orlando chapter of We Are Change has been promoting this, and he's here to film today. Mark Fensky from Gainesville, getting the word out. Mark Fensky. Dr. Bill Warwick from Gainesville, also getting the word out, and he's already been at the St. Augustine event. And last but not least, our man John Derrick, down from the Melbourne area, and his wife Marge. Thank you for coming out. Okay. And have I forgotten anybody who's been helping us? Oh yeah, right, that guy. So I appreciate you letting me take the time to acknowledge the people that made this happen today. Okay, now for our guests. What we're going to do is we're going to have our guest speaker present for about 45 minutes, an hour, whatever it takes. And at that point in time, we'll have a little break and go to question and answer then. So what I'd like to ask the audience to do is if you have questions or comments, please refrain to the question and answer break. We do have restrooms. If you go out towards the back exit there and turn to the left, the restrooms are on the left. And there's water fountains out here. If there is any kind of a problem where you need to speak with one of us during the talk, please grab one of us that has a blue and white Veterans for Peace t-shirt, and we'll quietly try to address your problem or concern. And And Helgi has something you may want to...
No, it's funny about the lights.
Okay, we'll get the lights after I read. Oh, and also, thank you, Mark. Mark, another one of our core Daytona Beach people, our guy who made our DVD questioning the U.S. war on terror, which is in the handouts. Please take the handouts. With that said, it's now time, plus 10, to introduce our guest, Christopher Bollyn. Christopher Bollyn is an investigative journalist and writer. After finishing high school in Schaumburg, Illinois, he sojourned in Europe and Middle East before studying languages, history, and journalism at the University of California at Davis and Santa Cruz. He earned a degree in history with the focus on the Israeli occupation of Palestine. After the first Gulf War, he led an international team of photojournalists on a trip through the West Bank and Gaza Strip. He has written in-depth articles about the Middle East, electronic vote fraud, the dangers of depleted uranium, and the history and geopolitical background of the terror attacks of 9/11. He has been invited to speak at numerous 9/11 events across Europe and the United States. And with that, we'd like to give a nice welcome to Mr. Christopher Bollyn.
Thank you. Thank you for the Veterans for Peace, Central Florida, for sponsoring this event, and We Are Change Orlando. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Christopher Bollyn. I'm a journalist, and I have been working to try and share the information, my research about 9/11. And I've written several books called Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, and original articles. This presentation is called Solving 9/11 Ends the War. And by that I mean the war on terror. Are the lights okay for everybody? Yep. Okay. This is, I was protesting outside the Oscar Academy Awards last February 22nd in Hollywood. This is the book called Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. This is my thesis presented in a very concise format. And the reason why I called the book Solving 9/11 is because we need to understand that the crime of September 11th was never properly investigated. It was not investigated as a crime. So solving 9/11 is my effort to solve the crime. And I realized as a journalist working in Washington, D.C. in 2001, that the government and the media were calling the attacks on 9/11 an act of war. And calling it an act of war allowed them to basically forsake or get past doing a criminal investigation. And what happened instead of a proper criminal investigation is that the evidence from the crime scene was destroyed. As you remember, we were given a narrative, we were given an explanation about what happened on 9/11 the very same day. And the president said that we had been attacked because some people in the Middle East hated our freedoms. So I began looking at the crime of September 11th as an investigative journalist. And that's what I've done. I've looked at the crime in its completeness, from the beginning of the planning through the crime itself, and then very importantly, the cover-up. The cover-up, because in such a crime, when you're not being given the straight story by the government or the media, and they're giving you a false story, there's a real story out there. There's a real narrative out there. What happened? And who did it? If Osama bin Laden didn't do it, somebody else did. And it's essential for our history to understand who did it. My background is as an investigative journalist in Washington, D.C. for the first 6 years of this century. Prior to that, I studied Middle Eastern history at the University of California, and my specialty was on Israel and Palestine. And prior to all the writing books and working as a journalist, I grew up in Schaumburg, Illinois, and I was an Eagle Scout and an altar boy. It was quite a different America than it is today. This picture, in 2004, this picture was taken at what's called the Citizens Grand Jury in California, just like it says there. And I was a presenter. I presented information for the Citizens Grand Jury. So the question is, why does 9/11 truth matter? Why is it so important? Well, why does the murder of John F. Kennedy still matter? These two crimes are very closely connected. Well, the murder of Kennedy matters because it was a coup d'etat. The powers behind the assassination took control of the government and orchestrated the cover-up. And a coup d'etat that is kept secret in a democratic nation means that the succeeding government that takes power is illegitimate. As we all know, that after Kennedy was killed, the United States rapidly upscaled their involvement in Vietnam, and that war went on for 20 years. Basically, the entire time I was in school growing up, the United States was at war in Vietnam. The Kennedy assassination matters because the U.S. government continues to support the lies of the Warren Commission, here being presented to LBJ. And the Kennedy assassination still matters because the mainstream media continues to this day to support the official version. And it matters because when the government supports the lies about the murder of the president, it means that the powers that killed Kennedy are still in charge to this day. This is just a graph to show you historically, the opinion of the American people regarding the murder of Kennedy. The top line, 80%, 70%, is the number of people who believe that there was a conspiracy. The bottom line, the dark green line, is the number of people who believe the Warren Commission. As you can see, the great majority, historically, has supported the belief that there were others involved. So, analogy. Why does 9/11 still matter? Here we are 14 years plus after 9/11. Why does it still matter? Why does it matter what happened that day? Why do we need to understand it? Well, it matters because the government continues to lie about what happened. Both the Obama and Bush administrations have maintained the lie and based policy on that lie. And it matters because it was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror. And as we know, a series of disastrous wars, most notably Afghanistan and Iraq. And the war on terror, as you know, is started in October 2001, is still going on to this day, at great expense to the American people and great loss of life. The latest phase of the war on terror is this mysterious group called ISIL, Islamic State. And this is a strange group because they seem to come out with Hollywood-style videos, yet they don't speak to the media or the public directly. They speak mostly through an Israeli website called Site Intelligence Group, based in McLean, Virginia, I think it is. And the Site Intelligence Group, SITE, that group is headed by an Israeli woman, a Mossad agent, named Rita Katz. And as you can see from the videos come to the public with the site stamp on top of the video. And if you read the papers or look at the news, whenever there's a new release about this Site Intelligence Group or other jihadist threats or what have you, if you read the fine print, you'll find they come to us, they come to the media from Site Intelligence Group, from Ms. Rita Katz. And one of the beheading videos, the second beheading video of an American citizen, was actually released by her Israeli website prior to the group releasing the video itself. And as she said on CNN, and in fact, within a short time after our release to her subscribers, ISIS account on social media indicated that within a short time, they would be releasing the video. Only we actually had that video beforehand and were able to beat them with the release. So obviously there's a close connection there between Israeli intelligence and the Site Intelligence Group and this ISIS group. And the media. The media is the agency that speaks to us. We understand the Middle East, we understand what's going on, we understand the war on terror primarily through what the media tells us. And this is what Time magazine came out a few years ago, and I said that 9/11 truth matters because for 14 years the mass media has pushed the lies about 9/11 and the fraudulent war on terror, all the while suppressing real evidence and questions about what really happened on 9/11. So that people like me, when Fox News or CNN would interview me, they pretended to be interested in the 9/11 story and my evidence and my research, but very quickly they turn on me and they try to portray me as being an anti-Semite or something like that. Now, I want to say that my research, what I'm going to present to you today in this little presentation, is basically some of the fruits of my research. I've been investigating 9/11 for 14 years. For the first 6 years, I was a paid journalist. I was paid to do that until we got to the discovery of thermite, and then things got pretty hot. And I left the country after that. I lived in Europe for the last 7 years. But the information I'm going to present to you, I don't mean to be offensive to anybody. I don't want to, if the information I present to you differs from what you have heard or what you might think, I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to argue with anybody. I'm just presenting some factual information and some connections and some names that are important to understand what happened on 9/11. The media that has presented to us this false narrative of what happened on 9/11 in this country today is controlled by 6 companies. We now have a situation where it's basically a media monopoly in this country of 6 countries that control the media. This man here, Rupert Murdoch on the left, is one of the big media moguls. And to understand how Mr. Murdoch has the assets, has the wealth to take over 160 newspapers in 2003 and media across this nation and around the world, especially the English-speaking world, you have to understand that he is funded and sponsored by the Rothschild family, has been for a long time. And the money that these media guys have to take over our media comes from banksters like the Rothschilds. Because the real purpose of the media in our country today is not to inform us, but to manipulate our opinion. And so we've been played with in what I call a gigantic psychological warfare operation for years, in which we are the targets. We're the target audience. Now, if the media and the government are lying to us about September 11th, it means that they are controlled by the very same people who carried out 9/11. Now, that's one thing, if anything, you take away from this presentation today, is to keep that in mind. The media and the government that we have are basically controlled by the same people who carried out 9/11.
Actually,
Wait, let's take questions later. Now, if you don't believe the official account, if you have skeptical thoughts about what happened on 9/11, about the official version, what we've been given, you should understand that you are in the majority. This little image shows you that only 40% of the American people actually believe the official account. 60% doubt it, or don't believe it at all, or don't have an opinion, are unsure about it. So skeptics, 9/11 skeptics, are indeed in the majority. This shows you sort of the progress, how that skeptical faction grew. In 2002, when asked if they thought that the Bush administration was telling the truth or hiding something or lying, 2002, 73% of the population thought they were mostly lying or hiding something. And two years later, that increased to 76%. 2 years later, that went to 81%. And so that blue section at the bottom of this chart here is the percentage of people who think the administration was telling the truth. And when they found that, in 2006, when they found that only 16% of American people thought the Bush administration was telling the truth about 9/11, they stopped doing polls. Now, if you don't believe the official version, you're in good company. The people who wrote that official version don't believe it. Here is the senior counsel. His name is John Farmer. He was the senior counsel to the 9/11 Commission. And he said in his book that he wrote after he worked on the commission, he said, what government and military officials told Congress, the commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. The chairman of the 9/11 Commission This is Thomas Keane in the foreground and Lee Hamilton. Thomas Keane said, "To this day, we don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth." NORAD was the North American air defense system that was doing an operation that day. So, what really did happen on 9/11? Why were we given a pack of lies? Why did the government bend over backwards to tell us a false story? The media as well. Well, Larry Johnson, a former deputy director for counterterrorism at the U.S. State Department, said shortly after 9/11, he said, "We don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation." This was quite a sophisticated operation. After 9/11, I was working at my home. I wrote from Chicago for the newspaper in Washington. And we were in Washington, we were in New York City on September 11th, passing through early in the morning before these things happened. But when I got home and started writing, my very first articles were raising doubts about the official version and pointing out that the government was not being forthcoming and honest about what happened on 9/11. Notably, two things: the evidence of explosions on 9/11 and also the presence and involvement of Israelis on 9/11. And those two things were being completely omitted from the newspaper, from the New York Times. So I thought, how safe can it be for me to be questioning and raising doubts about the official version when the government is going to war based on this false version? So I was a little bit prudent, and I thought that we should transfer to Europe. So we transferred to Berlin, and I was working as a foreign correspondent for the newspaper in Germany. And I met these people who were former heads of German intelligence. I talked to three of them in the very first week I got there. And this man, his name is Mr. Wertebach, Eckhard Wertebach, he said the deathly precision and magnitude of planning behind the attacks would have needed years of planning. Such a sophisticated operation would require the fixed frame of a state intelligence organization, something not found in a loose group of terrorists like the one led by Mohammed Atta. I mean, when you look at the crime, hijacking planes, flying them into buildings at high speeds, outwitting the entire air defense system of the United States of America. This is not done by some college students, that just get an idea to attack the United States. This is very, very sophisticated. Then I met this man, Andreas von Bülow. He's a German parliamentarian who used to oversee the German intelligence organizations. I met him in November 2001. This picture was taken 10 years later when I met for the 10th anniversary of our meeting. He told me something very interesting. He said in a false flag operation like 9/11, there are three levels. There's the architectural level, the people who plan the crime and design the crime to be blamed on an enemy in order that the public then is upset with that other party and willing to wage war. So it's meant, the architectural level is meant to change public opinion. And the public opinion they wanted to change is us, the United States. That we are the target audience. We were the people who were meant to be terrorized, shocked, and awed into going to war. And we still are. We still are that target audience, which is why the mainstream media will not cover my events, which is why the 9/11 Truth Movement in many towns in this country will not have me, because the information I'm giving to you, they don't want you to hear. The second level is the managerial level. These are the people who actually manage the crime and the cover-up and the deception. These are high-level people. Then the third level is the working level. And as he described, the 19 Arab hijackers are, for example, the working level terrorists. And they're part of the deception. They're part of the deception, whether they know it or not. 15 of the 19 alleged hijackers lived in this state and had been issued, at least 6 of them or 7 of them had been issued duplicate licenses. Basically, the next day after they got their license, somebody called up and said, "I'm Mohammed Atta. I have a new address. I need a new license. Can you issue one in my name and send it to this address?" And they got it. Now what that means, and that others had reported lost passports. What that means is that you have two documents in the same name in circulation. So, for example, there's Muhammad Atta is over here in Hollywood, Florida, and in Delray Beach, another Muhammad Atta is having drinks and watching striptease. Which one's the real one? Well, this is a very sophisticated operation known as like laying a trail. That the perpetrators of the crime lay a trail of evidence that's meant to be picked up by the authorities and by the media to implicate the people they want to implicate. A very good understanding of how this kind of sophisticated operation works is presented in John le Carré's book, The Little Drummer Girl, written in 1982 with the help of Israeli intelligence. He was instructed on these methods by a former head of Israeli military intelligence. It's in the very beginning of the book, his acknowledgments. And they also made a film. Diane Keaton plays in the role as a George Roy Hill film. And in the book, a very important statement is made here when it's one of the culprits, one of the Israeli Mossad guys says, "Terror is theater. Theater is a con trick." Do you know what that means? Con trick? You've been deceived. But the first part, terror is theater. That you need to understand and keep in mind when you see the next terrorism attack happen, whether it's in France or in Germany or in the United States. Always remember that terrorism is meant to affect how you think about something. It's theater, and we're the audience. And just keep that in mind. Here's the public knowledge of 9/11, the lead editorial 3 years after 9/11 in the New York Times. This is the newspaper's editors talking to the public. And they're talking about the public knowledge of 9/11. Basically what the third sector is allowed to know about 9/11. The first sentence is very interesting. They say, in the 3 years since 9/11, we've begun to understand that it's possible to know what happened without knowing what happened. And this is basically the opinion, this is basically the position that the New York Times and the controlled media in this country have taken all along. If you look at the mainstream media in this country, they have never addressed any questions about 9/11 that contradict in any way the official version. So people like me, as I said, we're persona non grata. We're not welcome to the discussion. They don't want to talk to Richard Gage, for example, about what happened to the buildings. To question the official version is considered to be treasonous. So if 9/11 is a deception, what is the war on terror? Where did it come from? Well, I just happened to, here's my book, The War on Terror is an Israeli Zionist Fraud, which I point out in the book. In this book, it's this is the concise analysis of my 12 years of research when this book came out. And thanks to a generous supporter who's helping me get around Florida, Sachi, the first 10 people that buy books today will get $10 off. So that means that this book, which usually goes for $20, will be $10 for the first 10 people. And both books together, which usually go for $40, will be $30, just so you know. Now, where did the war on terror come from? It's an Israeli construct. It's a construct that came to us from Israel. And the person who is the main promoter of this idea is Mr. Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his late father. Mr. Netanyahu, his father, the older man here, was the head of the new Zionist organization. Now, I don't want to go into great detail about that, but what that is basically the Jabotinsky School of Zionism. They created, the Jabotinsky is the hardline founder of revisionist Zionism. And he died in New York City in 1940. And when he passed away, Mr. Netanyahu took over the leadership of the new Zionist organization, which is the Jabotinsky School of Zionism, which basically says that the posture of the Israelis vis-a-vis the Palestinians has to be one of iron. Iron wall, iron brain, iron fist. And if you look at recent Israeli history, many of the operations are called iron fist, iron brain. And the idea of building an iron wall is what they built in Palestine, across the Holy Land, which now separates the Palestinians from the Israelis, like a giant Berlin Wall, except it's twice as high and like 40 times longer than the Berlin Wall. It's hideous, but it surrounds Jerusalem, it surrounds Bethlehem, it basically even goes so far to separate the Palestinians from their own villages and farmland, what have you. This is the iron wall that Mr. Jabotinsky wanted the Israelis to build, and he said you would have to build it. After 9/11, they built it. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu, was working for a Rothschild company in Boston called the Boston Consulting Group in 1976 and through 1978, right when I was living in Israel, actually. And in 1979, he came to Israel and created what's called the Netanyahu Institute on Terrorism. And in 1979, they had a Jerusalem conference. This is a Netanyahu Institute with his father. And George Bush spoke there, Papa Bush spoke there as a candidate for vice president, and basically agreed with this whole idea that the United States should bring its military into the region to attack those nations and those entities who are challenging Israel. So that's basically what the war on terrorism is all about. And 9/11 was the kickstart to get that going, that war going. And this is a photograph of Mr. Netanyahu. It's from an article called Bilateral Relations. I don't mean to make it look like a mugshot, but that's from the article. And he was asked about how 9/11, on September 11th, he was asked by James Bennett of the New York Times, how will these attacks, 9/11, how will they affect the relationship between the United States and Israel? And Mr. Netanyahu just blurted out, it's very good. He said, well, it's not very good, but it will generate immediate sympathy for Israel. And he was almost gleeful. He was almost gleeful. This is from the New York Times, September 12th, September 12th paper. Later, he was speaking in Israel at Bar Ilan University in Hebrew, and it was reported in Ma'ariv newspaper and Haaretz in Israel in Hebrew. He said to this audience, we, meaning the Israeli people, are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and the American struggle in Iraq. Of course, that's three things, but in his mind, it's one thing, which is also rather telling. Now, what's interesting to note here is that Mr. Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel, has been the chairman of the Likud party, or the Likud coalition in Israel, since 1993. Now, what is the Likud, and what is their relationship to terrorism? This man was the former Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister and head of the commando unit Sayeret Matkal and other things. He was in the London studio of the BBC on September 11th, and before the towers had even fallen, he was interviewed, and he was asked, by the BBC for his opinion. And he said, the world will never be the same from today on. This is before the towers had even fallen. He said, we assume, we know that basically bin Laden is behind this. We know where bin Laden is. And he said, now is the time for the United States to lead the world and to begin to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. He has a very thick accent. He says something like that. Well, what is the relationship between Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Barak? Well, Mr. Barak, Ehud Barak, was Netanyahu's commander in a covert commando force in Israel called the Sayeret Matkal. Sayeret Matkal is an independent covert force under the direct command of the Israeli Chief of Staff and Israeli military intelligence, which is the same line. Now, other members of the Sayeret Matkal were also involved on 9/11. For example, Daniel Levin of Akamai was on Flight 11. This man here with the red beret on his shoulder was Chief of Staff on 9/11, when 9/11 happened in Israel. His name is Shalom Mofaz. He's Iranian. And here he is, a few months after 9/11, in January 2002, meeting with Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz and others like that's Mr. Zakheim across the table, and sitting next to him on his right is Douglas Faith. Now, this is an example of how the Israelis have access, the highest level Israeli military characters have direct access to the highest level people who make defense policy in this nation. Now, what were these guys talking about? As Wesley Clark revealed on a show, Democracy Now! I think it was, he said about 10 days after 9/11, he was walking through the Pentagon visiting. He met Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld. And one of the generals called him in and said, "Sir, we've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq." And Wesley Clark said, "We're going to war with Iraq?" He said, "Why?" Now this is just 10 days after 9/11. And the general said, "I don't know." And Wesley Clark came back a few weeks later, and by then we were bombing Afghanistan. And he said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And the general said, "Oh, sir, it's worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran." And as you can see by that list of countries, we have been militarily engaged with most of those countries in one way or another since 9/11. So this is what the war on terrorism was meant to be. It was supposed to bring the United States into the Middle East on a huge scale, militarily, engaged with many countries at the same time, which is what we're now doing. Where did this idea come from? Well, it started with David Ben-Gurion, this man here, the founder of the State of Israel. They call him the founder. He's a Rothschild agent. He worked on a Rothschild plantation in Israel called Rishon LeZion. And they decided that this man would be the guy that they could use, and so he became Mr. Israel. He was the head of the Haganah and became the first prime minister of Israel. And he said in 1948, shortly after Israel became a nation, he said, "We should prepare to go over to the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria." And then he has a plan for how to take Lebanon. And he said, if Egypt dares to fight or to stand in the way, we'll bomb Port Said, Alexandria, and Cairo. So this here, the founder of the State of Israel, is laying out a plan for Israeli hegemony in the region. Israeli superiority, dominance. Well, what's behind that? This is what's behind it. It's called Greater Israel. This particular graphic comes from an Israeli website called jewsnews.co.il, October 2013. The article is called "What Israel's Future Borders Will Look Like." And this is between the 2 rivers, Nile and the Euphrates, which is what the 2 blue lines on the Israeli flag stand for. They stand for the river Nile and river Euphrates. So this is not a new concept. And how will they get this regional dominance? How will they conquer these big countries? By breaking those big countries up in a process that's called Balkanization. When you break up a country, a large country like Syria or Iraq, into ethnic statelets. And this is what was done in Yugoslavia, if you remember in the 90s. Yugoslavia was a big socialist country in the corner of Europe down there. And with a little bit of instigation and a little bit of terrorism, they got Serbs to be at Croats' throats, Albanians at Macedonians, and everybody was just like broken up into ethnic groups. And the same thing you saw in Iraq. Bombs going off at Shiite, weddings, and bombs going off at Sunni parties. And these bombs were always called suicide bombers, but nobody ever saw the suicide bomber. They just said, "Oh, it's a suicide bomb. Car goes off, bomb goes off." And what was happening is that wedges were being driven between the various ethnic groups so that you now have in Syria a broken country. Iraq is a completely broken country. Iraq is now a country in 3 pieces. Now this was called the Yinon Plan. That's Oded Yinon, an Israeli scholar. And he presented this in the year 1982. The article is called "A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s." So as soon as the Likud came to power in the 1970s, this plan went into effect. And here you see what they want to do, like Libya, break it up into pieces. Syria, Iraq, even Saudi Arabia, break it into pieces. Along ethnic lines. Here you see, for example, Iraq. The green section is the Shiite area. The yellow section is the Sunni area, ISIS today. And the red area is the Kurdish area in the north. Now, it's very interesting here, on the bottom line, you know, the dissolution of Syria and Iraq, this is from the Yinon Plan. To break, in ethnically or religiously unique areas such as Lebanon. That's Israel's primary target, while the dissolution of the military power of those states serves as the primary short-term target. That's important to understand. What they wanted to do first was to reduce the power of Iraq's military, of Syria's military, of every country's military. You bring them down militarily. Now, how were the Israelis going to do that? Welcome the United States. So this is the map of the Middle East as is understood with the national boundaries. This is an idea of how they want to break it up into ethnic statelets. So the big countries get broken up into little statelets, and each little statelet is comprised of an ethnic group, which would mean that Israel would be one ethnic state in a sea of other ethnic states. You see? Then Israel would no longer be on the defensive as being an ethnic state for a select group of people. They'd say, well, look, the Shiites are there, and the Sunnis are there, and the Jews are here. It's just like everybody else, right? This is normal. So they want to create a new norm. I would say that Americans should be loath to the idea of supporting a state where only a certain ethnic group can be citizens. That's basically un-American. Now, the war on terror. How successful has it been? As you can see, it's been very successful in creating terrorism. Terrorism today is 10 times greater. The incidents of terrorism are 10 times greater than they were in 2000. That red line and the black line show how terrorism has climbed. If you look at the dark brown section, that's Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Syria. And you see it went from basically non-existent terrorism in the year 2000 to 6,000 attacks per year. And now it's much higher. Now we know in Syria it's much higher. This ends in the year 2012. And, you know, the war in Syria has only started then. How has it hurt us in the pocketbook? We were paying $300 billion a year for defense when 9/11 happened. Basically, that expenditure has doubled per year. So now we're spending about $700 billion per year. So there's basically $1,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States of America was what we were paying. Now we're paying about $2,000 for every man, woman, and child. So if you wonder why there's so many poor people who don't seem to have access to any government largesse, it's because all the government largesse that we ever had is being spent on war. Now, I mentioned that Mr. Netanyahu was the chairman of the Likud party. Well, what is the Likud party? Unfortunately, Zionism is not taught in American schools or universities. Our Congress jumps up and down 29 times when the head of the Likud party speaks to Congress. When Netanyahu spoke at Congress, he had 29 standing ovations. And every member of Congress is subservient to this doctrine. But the American people don't know really anything about Zionism. What is Zionism? Well, Zionism is basically Jewish nationalism. You know, the idea that the Jews should have a state. Where did it come from? There's a long history. But basically, it was promoted and first started and pushed by the Rothschilds. And they promoted it in the Eastern European area, known as the Pale of Settlement, through the use of their secret societies, like B'nai B'rith and B'nai Moshe, and Lovers of Zion. These are secret societies that went through Eastern Europe and told the Jewish communities there that they should consider themselves to be Zionist, Jewish nationalists, and they should start learning Hebrew and stop speaking Russian or Belarusian or whatever, and they should aspire to going to Israel, to Palestine, and populating that region. Well, the terrorist founders of the Likud, these are these characters here. The man in the middle is the founder of the party. His name is Menachem Begin. The man on the far side there, the older man, that's Yitzhak Shamir. And their protege here is Ariel Sharon. These are the three men who were most notably the founders of the Likud party. They founded in 1973, and they came to power in 1977. And basically, since 1977, the Likud has dominated Israeli politics. It has ruled Israel. It's a party of terrorists. These men were the terrorist leaders of the Zionist militia in Palestine in the 40s. The man in the middle, Begin, was the leader of the Irgun. I'll say more about that. Mr. Shamir was the head of the Lehi, or Stern gang. These were well-known terrorist groups. This is the emblem of the Irgun, Mr. Begin's group. And as you can see, you see that map again. That map that I pointed out earlier, that's known as Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And the emblem is, of course, the land of Israel, the large, greater Israel, and the gun. And in Hebrew, it's written there, rak kach, only thus. Only thus will they settle for the Israel, and only through the use of gun will they achieve that. And this was Jabotinsky. The Irgun was created by Jabotinsky, and remember I told you Mr. Netanyahu was the executive director of that new Zionist group, the Jabotinsky group, when Vladimir Jabotinsky died in New York City in 1940. A little Zionist history, but it's important to understand. Here's Menachem Begin. I think this picture is taken in 1948. Born in Russia, came to Palestine in 1942, became the leader of the Irgun, that militia I told you about, and then promptly ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel. But the bombing of the King David Hotel is a very important crime to understand. It's the worst act of terrorism in Israeli-Palestinian history. 93 people died when the hotel was attacked. And basically the hotel was attacked because it was a center of the British mandate, headquarters for the British officers, the British military that controlled Palestine. And it was bombed because the British had gone on an operation throughout the country, and they had collected evidence that implicated even the heads of the Jewish agency in terrorism. And had these implications, had these convictions, had these prosecutions gone forward, all the leadership of the Zionist movement in Palestine would have been hanged. So they had to do something. So in 1946, shortly after that countrywide operation called Black Sabbath, they bombed the King David Hotel, where all the evidence was, and where the people who were carrying out the operations to prosecute those people had their base. This is British headquarters. In 1973, he created the Likud party, as I told you, and became prime minister in 1977, and then in 1978 began invading Lebanon. So he started putting into effect immediately that plan that I showed you earlier from when David Ben-Gurion said, we will go into Lebanon, we will go to the Litani River, we will install a Christian government that's supportive of us. That was what happened in 1982. That was Mr. Menachem Begin's work. Here is his handiwork when he had the hotel bombed, that's the King David Hotel. 93 people were killed, and it was a false flag operation. What happened is that the Zionist terrorists put on the Arab headdress, the keffiyeh, and dressed up like Palestinians, and brought in those big milk cans, and brought them down into the basement, and put them around the columns that supported the building, and bombed it. And here's from the Palestinian police force. This is from the British period, the mandate period in Palestine. Basically, after World War I, the British had a mandate to govern Palestine. And there's Menachem Begin at the top, and Yitzhak Shamir, the second one from the bottom, second from the left on the bottom. And these are the people who created the Likud party. Another member of the Likud party, or of the Stern gang under Yitzhak Shamir, was Rahm Emanuel's father, Dr. Benjamin Emanuel. Now lives in Chicago. As you know, Rahm Emanuel is now the mayor of Chicago. But he was the special advisor to President Clinton, and he was the chief of staff for Obama. The first appointment Obama made when he became president was this man. And this man, according to Sherman Skolnick of Chicago, an investigative journalist, was the Mossad agent in both White Houses. I think Sherman Skolnick was probably right about that. This man is also, there's a note, this man, Rahm Emanuel, is single-handedly given credit for the passage of something called NAFTA in 1993. NAFTA, of course, decimated our manufacturing sector and was pushed through a Democratic Congress in 1993 thanks to this guy's methods of extortion and personal threat and everything else that he does. He's quite a ruthless politician, if you know anything about him. He's now mayor of Chicago. Here's Mr. Begin, and he was asked in 1974 how does it feel to be considered the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Mr. Begin said, in the Middle East, in all the world. In all the world. Meaning that he considered himself to be the father of terrorism in all the world. And if you look at the history, it's not far from the truth. The use of terrorism as a method to make strategic gains has been employed by the Israelis since before the creation of the Israeli state. That's not anti-Semitic to say that, that's simply a fact. Here's Mr. Shamir, for example, one of the founders of the Likud party. He was involved in the murder of this Volker Bernadotte, who was the United Nations envoy to Palestine. And then in 1962, Shamir was in charge of an operation called Operation Damocles, in which the Mossad was killing German scientists in Egypt and in Germany and in Europe, sending them letter bombs and things like that, because they were helping Egypt to develop its rocket program. And in 1963, when David Ben-Gurion put an end to this murder of German scientists called Operation Damocles, Yitzhak Shamir, here on the bottom left, resigned from the Mossad in protest after the Director General of the Mossad, the first one, Yisrael Harel, was forced to resign because of his use of terrorism. So an Israeli prime minister made the head of Mossad resign because his terrorism was going too far. This is Yisrael Harel. And in 1980, he told an American Zionist named Michael Evans. Michael Evans was having dinner with this man and said, do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why? And Mr. Harel said, I fear it will come to America. He said, America has the power but not the will. The terrorists have the will but not the power. And he said, but money will change everything. As to the where, Yisrael Harel continued, New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely that they, the Arab terrorists, will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building and a symbol of your power. Lo and behold, 21 years later, his uncanny prediction came true. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the main characters in the setting up of the 9/11 crime. And here are two of them. These are two men who worked with Yisrael Harel in the Mossad. They came to America in the 1980s. The top one is named Zvi Malkin. The one below is Avraham Shalom Ben Dor. Their names are probably pretty close to what Israelis use a lot of different names. But what happened here is that these men came to America, were in New York City, and they then claimed to represent a company called Atwell Security of Tel Aviv, which was owned and created by Mr. Mossad himself, Shaul Eisenberg of China. And they negotiated to get the security contract for the World Trade Center and for the Port Authority of New York, which owns the World Trade Center. Meaning that these guys were getting the security contract for the harbors, the ports, the airports, the bridges, the tunnels, and the World Trade Center. And when somebody at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey discovered that the bottom man, Avraham Shalom, was also known as Avraham Ben Dor, a convicted murderer in Israel, as he was when he was head of the Shin Bet, he told his men to crush some Palestinian skulls with rocks that they'd been captured, and they did that, and that caused, in 1984, that caused a trial, and he was found guilty of this murder. When that was discovered by the Port Authority, when they found out this man's real name, or the name he went by, they nixed the contract. They tore up the contract. Had they not torn up the contract for these men, Atwell Security of Tel Aviv, to get the Port Authority's security, 9/11 would have happened in the 1980s. You see, that would have put it much earlier on. But they were thwarted. But they didn't go home. They didn't quit. They then worked through somebody called Jules Kroll, the man at the top, who was a business partner with Maurice Greenberg, the man on the bottom. Maurice Greenberg is, of course, the former chairman of AIG and the recipient of $180 billion in the bailout in 2008 and 2009. But they had a company called Kroll Associates. And after the bombing in 1993 of the World Trade Center, Kroll Associates got the security contract for the World Trade Center. And they overhauled the entire security for the World Trade Center and the Port Authority. And the first plane flew into their secure computer room. The very first plane hit the North Tower, went into their controlled, secure computer room. So now, one thing you need to understand about these characters, for example, is that they are connected to the Israeli enterprise at the highest level. At the highest level. These are not just the kind of Zionists who put $1 in the blue boxes in the synagogue. These guys are connected to the highest level Israeli military top brass through something called the Challenge Fund and you know, these other organizations. Those are the kind of details that you have to read the books to find out, because it's too much to go into in a short presentation like this. But these are avid supporters of the State of Israel and very close to the current leadership of the State of Israel, militarily and politically. This was the head of Kroll at the time of the 9/11. Kroll Associates was headed by this man. His name is Michael Cherkasky. What's interesting about him is that he was also working for the district attorney, Robert Morgenthau, and he led New York's investigation of the first bombing in 1993. Then, in 1994, he went to work for Kroll and oversaw security at the World Trade Center. And then he became the head of Kroll in 1997, and in 2001 he became the CEO, May 2001. And then, as you know, Kroll Associates had control of the security of the World Trade Center and the Port Authority. And in September 2001, World Trade Center security was clearly compromised and breached under his company's authority. And then later, Marsh McLennan, the group that actually the first plane went into their controlled computer room, their secure computer room, they then bought Kroll for $1.9 billion. It's a lot of money for a little company like that. Here's Jerome Hauer, a former employee of Kroll, and this man worked for Giuliani, and he created the Office of Emergency Management. And this man, Jerome Hauer, is the person, he's also a Zionist, he put the hardened bunker in World Trade Center 7, the building that fell at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the third building that fell, 1 and 2 fell in the morning, then at 5:20 at night, the 47-story building fell down, owned by Larry Silverstein. And on the 23rd floor, there was a hardened bunker, which he had put in there. And it's most likely that the operation of the demolition of the Twin Towers was managed from that hardened bunker. And this man, Jerome Hauer, was in San Diego that day. He was no longer working for Kroll. And he spoke on TV. TV was very glad to have him on. And he explained to the public that 9/11 and the destruction of the towers was clearly caused by the burning jet fuel. And had nothing to do with explosives. So this is a man who also blamed bin Laden. So you see, very early on, before Americans could even catch their breath, they were given a narrative, an explanation, which all followed the same line, blaming Osama bin Laden and blaming the jet fuel, and giving us an explanation so we would go to bed that night thinking that we understood what happened. Now, this is called Ideation. This is a film that was made in 1978 by a senior Mossad agent. He's much more higher than that. His name is Arnon Milchan. He also made the movie JFK, for example. His very first film he made in 1978 was a film called The Medusa Touch, in which Richard Burton had these telekinetic powers, and the climactic scene in the movie is a 747 crashing into a high-rise building. This is called ideation. This is putting the idea out there that 747s or big Boeing airliners might fly into buildings someday. This is the cover of the book. Now, who's Arnon Milchan? He's Israel's leading nuclear smuggler. He worked for a super secret organization called Lacham, which was basically an Israeli unit headed by Rafi Eitan, in which they had agents in America, like him, who were collecting the necessary components for Israel's nuclear arsenal. And this man, for example, was involved in the smuggling of some 850 nuclear triggers, which are needed to detonate a nuclear bomb, to Israel in 1985. He was not implicated or charged in any way. Only his employees went to jail. The men that he worked for him, the non-Jewish guys, the non-Israelis, the Americans who worked for him, went to jail for a long time. He got off scot-free. Here he is in 1978, the year he made that movie, speaking with Defense Minister Ezra Weizman. These men are very close. So when I say that these guys are close to the top of the Israeli military establishment, that's what I mean. They are buddies with the guys that run Israeli military. And the Israeli military runs the state of Israel. Here he is between Shimon Peres and Benjamin Netanyahu. And another thing, there's a book came out about him a couple years ago called Confidential, and it's a biography about him. And it explains that this man has been a besides being a nuclear smuggler, besides being Israel's top agent in America, he was also laundering money for South Africa and Israel in America. So he comes to the table, they say, with about $5.2 billion. He's a very well-heeled Israeli producer in Hollywood. But with a long history of laundering money, you have to ask, where does the money come from? That's a legitimate question. In the year 2000, he and his partner, Rupert Murdoch, their company, produced this film, a TV film called The Lone Gunman. And the pilot episode, the first episode of this TV show, was made in Canada in 2000 and shown on TV, on Fox TV, in March 2001. And in this film, a Boeing 767 or 757 was remotely hijacked while the pilots were flying, on autopilot. The plane was being hijacked, and somebody came to the cockpit and said, you guys are not flying this plane. Somebody else is flying this plane. The pilot says, oh no, get out of here, get out of here. But then they see it's true. They cannot actually control the plane. And finally, through a little bit of trickery and getting a superior software going, at the very last minute, the control of the plane is returned to the pilots, and they miss striking the World Trade Center by inches. The climactic scene is when the plane just misses the tower. But now, this movie came out in 2000. I pointed out those details about this because you need to understand that is the kind of thing that's happening to Malaysian planes. Last year, for example, planes and things are being hijacked remotely. While the pilot is flying on autopilot, somebody with superior access to the plane, super user basic access, is getting into the control computer of the plane and hijacking the plane. Flight 370, for example. That's clearly what happened to that plane. The plane that went down, the Russian plane that went down in the desert. Another case. Now, this idea that we would have catastrophic terrorism that would change this country was being broadcast in these intelligentsia magazines like Foreign Affairs in 1998. And this article is called Catastrophic Terrorism, Tackling the New Danger. And it's written by Ashton Carter, who is now Secretary of Defense, John Deutsch, former head of the CIA, born in Belgium, and Philip Zelikow, the man who wrote the 9/11 report. And as you see, in 1998, they had an organization called, they had a study group called the Study Group for Catastrophic Terrorism. And this is basically the gist of their 2-year study. And they presented this out in this very well-known magazine so that people would read and come away with the idea that catastrophic terrorism is going to happen to America any day now. And when it does happen, these are the things we should do. Basically, this is like the blueprint for something that's going to happen in the near future. As they say in the bottom, long part of Hollywood and Tom Clancy repertory of nightmarish scenarios, catastrophic terrorism, like planes flying into buildings, has moved from far-fetched horror and films to a contingency that could happen next month. And they called it Imagining the Transforming Event. And as you see, it transformed America. It certainly did transform this place. Here's Ashton Carter and John Deutsch. They were working for a company. They were senior partners of Global Technology Partners, which became in the year 2000 an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. And its purpose is to acquire acquisitions and defense budget money by being involved in all this aerospace and defense and technology. And this is a group of neocons. It's called the Project for the New American Century. And it was a project of the Kagan family. This is the Kagan family down here that seems to have eternal fiefdom at this Department of State. They've been at the Department of State for a long time. Doesn't matter if Republicans or Democrats are in power, they're there. And they had this organization called PNAC, and they come out with some documents back when Clinton was president, and they said that, Mr. Clinton, you need to go and invade Iraq today. But Clinton held them off. He didn't invade Iraq. But then they came out with a document at the end of Clinton's administration, September 2000, and they said in this document, it's called Rebuilding America's Defenses, they said that America has to have control, full spectrum dominance of the world. And in order to have this, the United States will have to invade Iraq. Whether Saddam Hussein is in power or not, the United States will have to occupy Iraq and have permanent bases there. Isn't that what happened? And it said they said the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And lo and behold, the next year, we got that new Pearl Harbor. And these men at the top, these are the neocons who were all signed on to this document. If you remember when we had the presidential debates back in the year 2000, one of the questions that George Bush was asked was his position on regime change. Because they knew this was coming. This man, Philip Zelikow, is the one who wrote that article about the catastrophic terrorism. His name is Philip Zelikow. He then became the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, which is, as I showed you, it's the official myth. It's the official myth. And he wrote the whole thing. And he studied at Rice University, and his thesis was the creation and maintenance of the public myth, where he says that basically the public has to have a myth that they can latch onto, that they can believe, that they can accept as true. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. They have to have this myth. It's basically, in a word, it's lying, that the public should be lied to. Now, let's go very quickly to the reality of 2001. What really happened on 9/11? I'm going to show you here some of the most important bits of evidence to indicate that something quite different happened that day. Here we see the South Tower being struck. I point your attention to this hot white burning object that's coming out behind that pole. That is a piece of something that's burning white hot. It's not part of the airplane. And the aircraft entered the building, obviously on the left, but you see there's a tremendous explosion coming out that hole where the plane went in at something like 400 miles an hour. And that dark orange flame, that's the burning kerosene. That's the jet fuel burning. As you can see, most of the jet fuel burned immediately. Now that white hot object, that, to my mind, in my opinion, acted like the spark. That was the extremely hot object that went into the building first, created an extremely superheated environment in which anything explosive or combustible combusted, which is what happened. These are photographs of that plane said to be Flight 175, striking the South Tower. And as you can see, from Spiegel and CNN and photographers, there was something attached to the bottom of the plane that just before the plane struck the building, released what appeared to be a missile, which struck the building just before the plane struck. And here's a better photograph. It's not that sharp, it's from a video. But you can see on the bottom of the plane, towards the top there on the fuselage, you can see the fuselage has an unusual groove down the middle, sort of indicative of a 767 tanker plane, and that there's something on the bottom there that doesn't belong there. And that thing fired a white-hot object that made a white-hot hole in the South Tower wall before the plane struck. And as you can see, that white-hot hole is about the size of the fuselage of the plane. Now that white-hot hole would allow the fuselage of the plane to enter the building. Obviously, if you make a hole in front of the fuselage, it's just going to go right into that hole. You can see that it's extremely hot. So that anything that's in that building, as that extremely white-hot object goes through the building, like depleted uranium, it's going to detonate anything that's in the building. So first it's going to detonate thermatic charges if they're in the building, for example. This also hit a computer room. This plane went into Fujibank's computer room. It was a floor which just contained big boxes of computers and computer servers and batteries for computers that were never plugged in. So what was in those boxes is another mystery. But in any case, you see, these two objects that you see coming out in the foreground, if you can see that, one is burning white hot and leaving behind dark oxides. And having studied depleted uranium, I turned this photograph over to Marion Falk in Livermore, California. He was a staff scientist from the Manhattan Project all the way through Star Wars. And he taught me about depleted uranium. And I said, Marion, does this object have the characteristics of a burning uranium warhead? And he said, yes, it does. And you see it's burning so hot that there's a gap between the burning object and the actual oxides, because the oxides are so hot that they have to cool down before they become visible. And here you see it's coming out really fast. If you look at the videos, if you watch the videos of the South Tower, watch what comes shooting out the far side of the building. And you see it's coming out as fast or faster than the plane hit the building. So if you have the plane firing a missile, you've got some real velocity going there and some real momentum. And this is an interesting photograph because this shows the entry wound. What you see is that the entry wound of the South Tower, a very powerful explosion came out the entry wound. This is not kerosene burning. This is something else. It's producing a lot of white smoke and a very bright flame. Over on the other side of the building, that's where you see the kerosene burning. That's where the plane was going out. Here, you see, I call this the white smoke of thermite. You see the whiteness, the white smoke was the first combustion. Then whatever combusted afterwards comes later. But this white smoke that you see on the fringes of this detonation, of this combustion, is indicative of thermite, because thermite creates aluminum oxide, which is a white smoke. And it also creates the pure metal of the oxidizer, like molten iron, for example, and creates incredible heat. Incredible heat. This is America's silver bullet. This is the kind of, when I talk about depleted uranium, this is the thing that the US military uses to destroy all tanks all over the world. Because when depleted uranium hits something, it goes right through it like a knife through butter. And here you see again, more of that white smoke coming from around that explosion. Here again, more of the white smoke. And you see a lot of white smoke, the whitish smoke, came out of the entry wound itself. The dark smoke, that's the soot that's associated with burning kerosene. So when you talk about this incredible heat on that floor and the combustion of this jet fuel, you can see that most of the jet fuel was combusted in the first minute. In the very first minute, it was burned. This is the North Tower, and again, as I told you, this plane went into the secure computer room of Marshall McLennan, and it came in this north side, and their computer room was on the east side of the building and the north side of the building. So the plane hit the computer room, but you see on the east side of the building, there's also a tremendous white explosion coming out of the building. That doesn't make sense, because any explosion of the plane, if you just take the plane, it would have been the burning jet fuel. It would have been a darker explosion. It would have been a kerosene explosion, not this whiteness. So this is the kind of evidence you have to look at and try to understand that something else happened that day. As well here, we're told that the plane came in across the lawn on the Pentagon and that it struck the first level of the Pentagon. This baffles scientists. How can this happen? But it's also, it's contradicted by the evidence. You see there are these large spools of cable that are on the ground exactly where the plane would have passed. And that there's no indication there of any parts of the plane hitting the wall. You should understand that the exterior wall of the Pentagon is 1 meter thick, 1 yard thick, concrete and masonry. So a plane would have left some debris on the lawn. Whatever hit the Pentagon pierced through several walls and came out on this interior ring. There's an exterior wall on the interior ring of the Pentagon, and it created this large hole. But yet, if the plane is supposed to have created that hole, it doesn't jive with the evidence that these columns, these yellow columns, for example, are still standing. They're still standing. And this very last section here, you see the hole in the wall there on the bottom. That whole section there, around that hole in the wall, that was blocked off by the FBI, and the engineers were not allowed to enter that area. They put up plywood barricades. I spoke to the engineers, and they said we were not allowed in that area. Because had they been allowed in that area, they would have had some very serious questions about what made this hole. And why the plane, if the plane made that hole, why the columns, like these columns standing here, are still standing. It doesn't fit. But something much smaller went through there, punched out the hole, and left this very hot hole. And as you can see on the side, this photograph is courtesy of the FBI. As I said, engineers were not allowed to go there. And the people who went into this area on 9/11 and after 9/11 to recover and to clean up the area, at the Pentagon they all wore very sophisticated respiratory devices to prevent themselves from being contaminated. And this was the practice at the Pentagon. When they came out, they wore these kinds of moon suits, and when they came out, their feet were scrubbed and they were sprayed off, because they knew at the Pentagon that something had gone into that building and had left contamination that could cause death. So, but this was not the case at the World Trade Center. At the World Trade Center, there was no protection. If they had anything, they had those like little masks that you wear when you do drywall, for example. They had no protection at all, which is why 1,600 first responders have died in New York City. This is a photograph of a thermetic reaction occurring in the South Tower just before it fell. Basically 7 minutes before the building fell. This photograph shows you the time, the source, and you see there on the 80th floor, really on the 81st floor kind of, a thermetic reaction occurring. And if you see at the top of the picture, there's this white smoke again. This is a clear indication of a thermetic reaction. When thermite in its powder form is reacting, this is what it leaves: extremely hot, sparky fire, white smoke, and molten metal. And this is the molten metal that fell. Here is 1 minute later in the same place. You see there's a cascade of molten iron falling from this building. And the official government story has no explanation for this. There's no explanation. The official document sometimes refers to this as molten aluminum. Well, that's categorically false, because molten aluminum in these conditions would appear like the color of tin foil. And this is molten iron, most likely molten iron, pouring off. And this wall, this window that it's pouring from, is 2 feet wide. And you see a great deal is falling off. 1 cubic meter of molten iron weighs 6.5 tons or more. It's extremely dense material, which means that there was a lot of that stuff on that floor. Here's another photographic evidence of the use of thermite cutter charges. You see behind the middle firefighter, there's a column there, a box column, and that box column in the middle of the picture up at the top has obviously been cut with a cutter charge. And these are the box columns that hold up the World Trade Center. Both towers were held up with 47 of these box columns. And at the base, these box columns were 4 inches thick steel on the 4 walls. So that's a very, very strong column. And as you can see, there's slag material pouring down the side. You can see that it's been cut at an angle. So that particular column, and this is very early. Some people say, oh, this was taken after they started, using their torches and cutting these things. No. The presence of the firefighters indicates that this is in the first week or 2 after 9/11, because the firefighters were the first ones kicked off. They were locked out of the World Trade Center Ground Zero by the New York police, by the New York City Police Department. There were fistfights, and then the New York police were kicked off by the FBI. So this is very early on. These guys are looking for the remains of their lost 350 firefighters. This, of course, is Shanksville, Pennsylvania. This is a reclaimed mine. And this is a 20-foot hole. I spoke to the woman who ran down to this hole. There's a junkyard next door, something like that. And she worked there, and she ran down to this hole. And I asked her, how wide was the hole? And she had a trailer in front of her house that was 24 feet. She said it was not as wide, it was not as big as her trailer. So it was about a 20-foot hole and about 6 feet deep. And when the county coroner came to this, Wally Miller, when he came to this hole, he said he stopped being a county coroner after 20 minutes because there were no bodies. In fact, there was no evidence of a plane here. So this is a hole that was created in order to make us think that the plane went into the ground. And I visited Shanksville, and I spoke to the local newspaper. I wanted to ask them why they didn't report any of the eyewitness accounts or any of the questions about what people in Shanksville saw. And they said, well, when are you coming, Mr. Bollyn? Okay, Wednesday at 3 o'clock, okay. So I came there that day, and I went into a room, and they sat me down with an active U.S. military guy. His name was Labor Knight. And he was the person who was supposed to talk to me, Mr. Labor Knight. And so I asked him, Mr. Labor Knight, can you explain why, at the scene where we're told that the plane went into the ground, why there's no evidence of any of the aircraft. And he said, well, you have to understand that that ground is very soft. It was a reclaimed mine. And the plane came very fast. And when the plane hit the ground, he said the ground basically liquefied and swallowed the plane. But he said, but one wing bounced and went half a mile in the woods. And he told me this with complete conviction that he was telling me the truth. But this is absurd. I wrote about it in my article, it's in the book. But this is just to give you an indication of how absurd, when you start asking questions, when I started asking questions, when I started digging, these are the kinds of answers I was getting from people. And that little newspaper, I asked the editor, why have you never reported any of the 12 people who saw a military plane flying around that morning? And he said, well, we couldn't verify what they said was true. We couldn't validate, we couldn't verify, so we didn't print it. What's interesting is that when I visited the paper, this was like 2 years later, it's a little newspaper with 14,000 subscriptions, something like that, 14,000 circulation. They had built a new building for $2.5 million. So you see, if you go along with what the government tells you to do, you will be rewarded. And in this place, Wally Miller, I know him. He's a guy my age, and he is the coroner, local coroner. Pennsylvania law says that the county coroner is the sole responsible party official for any such crash scene catastrophe in Pennsylvania. He is the master of the scene. And I was talking to Wally Miller and some painters on his patio. They were fixing his place up too. And the painters said, Wally, tell them what the FBI told you. Tell them what the FBI said. And I said, well, hey Wally, what did the FBI tell you? And he said, he said that they said, Wally, basically, are you going to be a team player? Which meant, in real sense, are you going to give us control of the crash site? And you will be stationed at a reception center 6 miles away, dealing with questions from the media and the public. That's what happened. Wally did that. So Wally abdicated his responsibility as the coroner of Somerset County, gave it to the FBI. Now, where was the FBI looking? They're not looking in this hole, are they? They're not digging in this hole up. They did eventually. They were doing all of the debris recovery was going on about a quarter mile further in the woods, around the cabins of the Hoover family. And Reverend Hoover, he owns the cabins where the recovery was going on. I called him up, and when I started writing about the cover-up, the real cover-up at the end of the book in 2011, I said, Reverend Hoover, can you tell me why you have been silent about this? Why you have not told the American people that the debris field of Flight 93 was around your house, a quarter mile further than the hole? And he said, well, I was trying to cooperate. So that's what we had. We have people all across this country cooperating with the lie. Well, molten iron was certainly found in the rubble. This is a picture of them, the grabbers pulling out molten steel, basically, and it's dripping at the bottom. Because the official version cannot account for this, the official reports deny that it existed. Even though we have photographs, eyewitness testimony. This man, he worked on the NIST report that was meant to explain the collapse of the Twin Towers. And he said, he was asked in Texas about the pools of molten metal that I reported back in 2002. And he said, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. And he's fidgeting. If you ever look at the video, he's fidgeting a great deal. He's very nervous. He says, I know of absolutely nobody. No eyewitness said so. Nobody's produced it. Well, that's complete rubbish. Here are firefighters from New York who said, you get down below and see molten steel running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava, like a volcano. And they're all going, yeah. These guys saw it. And here you have a picture at the bottom. I called Peter Tully, who was involved in the excavation, the removal of the rubble. And he said, yes, he told me, he volunteered this information. He said, we found molten steel in the molten state at the bottom of both towers. 7 basement levels down. When they got to the bedrock of Manhattan, they found pools like this pool you see on the bottom of molten steel in the molten state. This is 5 weeks later, 6 weeks later. And this is in an oxygen-starved environment. That's very important. They had been spraying this pile continuously with water hoses, fire hoses, non-stop, because the rubble was so hot. But all the water that they poured on that, nothing put out these fires. Well, that's clearly an indication of thermite, because thermite can burn in an oxygen-starved environment, because the oxygen comes from the oxidizer that mixes with the aluminum. So another another good example or another good indication that something very strange happened involving thermite is the fact that the dust of the World Trade Center, that dust that rolled through lower Manhattan, was laden with these tiny balls of molten steel, iron. These are iron-rich spheres, not steel. And these are the spheres that are created when a thermetic reaction occurs, especially when a thermetic reaction on the nano level. Nano is a fancy word for something very, very, very small. Something that's in the nano size is smaller than 1/10 of a micron, which is a millionth of a meter in diameter. So we're talking super, super small. And when you create thermite at that level with such fine particles, then you get a much, much more powerful reaction. But you also get creation of little balls of iron like this. And these were created in the detonation or the demolition of the World Trade Center. And also, that picture was from the U.S. Geological Survey of the Dust. U.S. Geological Survey, official document. From the same survey of the dust, we have this photograph. This is a micrograph, a photograph of a little tiny sphere of molybdenum. Molybdenum is another metal, extremely, extremely high melting temperature. The melting temperature of this stuff is 4,753 degrees Fahrenheit. So nothing can explain such high temperatures except the fact that a nanothermite with molybdenum in it would create exactly this tiny spheres. Now, as I said, the rubble was extremely hot. It burned and burned and burned. The people that worked on the pile, their shoes were melting. They had to change shoes several times a day because everything was so hot. They're walking on this pile, breathing these fumes. It's like car exhaust. But in this smoke, there was a professor from California, UC Davis, where I went to school a little bit, and he sent called a Davis drum out there, and they put it on the roof of one of these buildings, and when this smoke blew through that drum, they could analyze the smoke particles. And this smoke contained a great abundance of nanoparticles again, these extremely small particles. Now, why that's important is for the same reason that I learned about with depleted uranium. When you inhale nanoparticles, if you inhale this smoke, for example, if you're so unfortunate, these tiny particles will not stop in your throat or in your lungs or in your capillaries. They go all the way into the nucleus of the human cell. And that's when they start wreaking havoc with the human system. This is why there are 1,600 dead first responders from the World Trade Center. Because they were not protected like those guys at the Pentagon. And they breathed the smoke. Like this guy here. He has no respirator whatsoever. Mind you, a respirator in these conditions will not block those nanoparticles. There is no respirator known to man that can stop nanoparticles. But it was like what Thomas Cahill said, it was like they were working inside the stack of an incinerator. That's the conditions they were in. They were doing their duty. They were doing their duty to their fellows and to their vocation. And they were basically being sacrificed. And what's interesting is that the EPA should have been monitoring these conditions at ground zero. When Thomas Cahill came from Davis, he sent the device first, the team put it up. He came like in October of 2001 to New York. The EPA met him at the airport, and they said, who's paying you to do this? Who's behind it? Who's telling you to do this, and who's paying for it? And he thought, as most Americans would think, that the government was doing this, that the government was monitoring the conditions in New York City. The government was monitoring the smoke that was coming from the pile. And he said they weren't doing anything. The EPA did absolutely nothing. I think her name was Todd Whitman, was then the Christy Todd Whitman. Then here, this is from the People magazine. I bought it at the local store 1 week after 9/11. And in the magazine, you have Louis Caccioli, a firefighter from Italy. He says, I was taking firefighters in an elevator to the 24th floor to get in position to evacuate workers. On the last trip up, a bomb went off. We think there were bombs set in the building. Now, if you read about Louis Caccioli, somebody got to him and he started to change his tune. But this is what he told People magazine in the first week. And then here's another person she says, we got down as far as the 74th floor. She's an office worker. And she said, and then there was another explosion. And William Rodriguez, the janitor from the North Tower, he'll tell you the same thing. There were explosions in the basement of the North Tower before the plane even hit the building. So there were bombs going off all over the place. But I tell you, that any kid that's at least 6, 7 years old, seeing such a thing happen would say, Daddy, that building's exploding. Because you see that the pulverization of the concrete and the broken pieces of steel and aluminum are being thrust sideways a full width of the building. That's 200 feet at great force. That means that there's extremely powerful energy in the center of the building throwing things out laterally. That's not a gravity collapse. Here's Van Romero. He's an expert in these things at New Mexico Tech. He did an interview. He was in New York, he was Washington, D.C. on 9/11. He watched these videotapes on TV. He saw what happened. He spoke to the Albuquerque Journal on September 11th. They came out with an evening edition, like a lot of papers did, evening edition on September 11th, and they quoted what he said. He said, my opinion is, this is a man that's expert, his expertise is in the explosive destruction of buildings. He says, based on the videotapes, that after the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the building that caused the towers to collapse. It would be difficult for the plane to trigger an event like that. Well, on September 11th, he was on his way to the Pentagon. He was on his way to the Pentagon to discuss defense contracts for his university. 10 days later, he did an about-face and spoke to the same paper again, Albuquerque Journal, and he said, well, no, clearly, I think that the fires from the burning jet fuel brought down the towers. And then the money started flowing to New Mexico Tech. Since then, New Mexico Tech has been given record amounts of money in its history from the Department of Defense. So as I say, now this is interesting because there's a lot of things about 9/11 people don't really understand or talk about. This is building 6. This is one of the lower level buildings that are about 8 stories high. You know, there's 4, 5, and 6. 3 was a Marriott Hotel. 4, 5, and 6. This is also called the U.S. Customs House. But if you can see the street is clean. That means that no building has fallen yet. North Tower, South Tower have not collapsed yet. But you see that the U.S. Customs House has really taken a blow. It's burning like crazy. Now, I have contacted the New York Fire Department about a year ago, and I said, I want to have the basic FERS report, that's the first responder. I want to have the basic metadata of what the New York Fire Department did at this building, what companies were involved, what actions they took. They said, Mr. Bollyn, we know what happened on 9/11. It's all part of the same thing. Basically, they won't tell me anything. And I sent my check for the data. They cashed my check, but gave me no information. Well, as you can see, that building was indeed devastated prior to the collapses. Here's a photograph taken after the collapses. You see the difference of the street. The street is cluttered with debris. That means that the North Tower has fallen and the South Tower both have fallen. But that building is right between Building 7 to the left and Building 1, North Tower to the right. Excuse me, the other way around. Yeah, no, to the left. Over here on this side, this is the phone building. Larry Silverstein's Building 7 is on this side. But what's interesting to see is here, this is the north face of the Customs House. The wall is blown out. The wall is completely blown out towards that Larry Silverstein's building. And this building is toast. What happened to it? Here you see an infrared photograph taken from space or whatever, up high. And you see that this is Building 6 here. This is the U.S. Customs House. And there's a huge crater in the middle of the building, which goes down below the bedrock. It goes down, as you can see from the dark blue, the dark green, and it goes very deep. So something blew a hole in this building. Now, the location of that hole is also the place where they had the vault. They had a vault under the building, which contained the evidence, criminal evidence from things like Enron scandal and big scandals in the 90s. That evidence was kept in this vault. As well, Building 7 had no vault because Building 7 had no basement. So all of the evidence from the federal agencies in Building 7 were also kept in that vault. Now, as we know, Kurt Sonnenfeld, the videographer with FEMA, he was able to go down into that building. He's the only guy that was able to go down there. And he poked his camera down to those doors of the vault, and he said that the doors had been blown open. There was a crack on the keypad on the side of the wall, and that the vault was empty. And that man now lives in fear of his life in Argentina. His name is Kurt Sonnenfeld, and his evidence, he says he's got the video evidence still. I don't know why he hasn't released it on YouTube. I would have done that a long time ago. But what this indicates is that that vault, that evidence vault and supposedly gold vault, had been plundered the night before. And in order to conceal the fact that it had been plundered, they blew it up. Now, whether it was blown up by a missile or blown up by charges, we don't know. Well, here is the man himself. He says it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. And that's the same logic I use. 9/11 was a crime that happened 14 years ago, but the cover-up of the crime has been going on ever since. And that is a crime. When you cover up a crime, when you conceal evidence, when you cover up a crime of this magnitude, you are participating in a criminal conspiracy. So I look at the cover-uppers. The number one cover-upper is the man here on the right side of the screen. His name is Michael Chertoff. He was the assistant to John Ashcroft. And when 9/11 happened, it fell into the lap of the Department of Justice Criminal Division, which was headed by Michael Chertoff. He was supposed to investigate the crime of 9/11 in order to prosecute the crime. The agency that is supposed to provide him with the evidence is known as the FBI. The FBI had a brand new director who had previously, under Papa Bush, had the same position that Mr. Chertoff is now in. That is Assistant Attorney General, Criminal Division. Now it says here that Ashcroft gave the 9/11 investigation to Mr. Chertoff. But what they did, they pulled here a little fast one. They said, well, 9/11 is not a crime, it's an act of war. Therefore, we don't have to investigate it. These guys have declared war on us, so we're going to attack war on them, and we're just going to clean up New York and let's get back to business. Let's go shopping and get back to business. And that's how they treated it. The evidence that was where 3,000, almost 3,000 people died, 2,700 people died, was treated as a big garbage dump, basically. They said, let's recycle this stuff. And they very quickly started taking all the steel to 2 junkyards in New Jersey, where it was being cut up 24/7 into pieces of steel 5 feet and smaller, mixed with other scrap, and sent to Asia. That's destruction of evidence. And Mr. Chertoff then went on to become the second Secretary of Homeland Security. Here he is when he was given that position under George Bush. This man with the blue tie in the middle is, of course, Philip Zelikow. He had previously served as the legal counsel for Condoleezza Rice. They're shaking hands with Mr. Ehud Olmert, who happened to be in New York City on 9/11. That's a very important thing I discovered. Ehud Olmert was in New York City on 9/11, although that was kept out of all the newspapers in America. The New York authorities didn't talk about it. The New York papers didn't talk about it. They didn't breathe a word of it. He's the mayor of the sister city of Jerusalem to New York City. He comes to New York City on September 10th, is most likely there on the 11th, but there's no mention of him being there at all. 10 days later, he comes back and shows up. But now, this quote here is from Philip Zelikow. And they're talking about, it's in context of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and whether the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq are a threat to the United States. And he says, I'll tell you what I think the real threat is, and actually it has been since 1990. It's the threat against Israel. See, the weapons of mass destruction, according to Philip Zelikow, were not a threat to the American people or the American state, but they were a threat to Israel, which is why we if you remember that Yinon plan, how we took down the military. The first goal is to take down the military of Iraq. That's what we've been doing since 1991, of course. Here's Philip Zelikow. He basically wrote the 9/11 Commission report before his staff even began writing anything. And he was the executive director. He decided who was spoken to, and what went into the report. So like my friend William Rodriguez, who was a janitor in the World Trade Center, who experienced explosions in the basement before the plane hit, he testified for 4 days before the commission. Not one word of what William Rodriguez said went into the report, because it didn't fit. It didn't fit the myth that Mr. Zelikow was putting together. This is another guy. This is Gene Corley. He's a concrete expert from Chicago, from Skokie, Illinois. And he was in charge of the FEMA engineering report that was done about the buildings. He also had done previously work, he had done similar reports on Waco, Texas, and Oklahoma City. So he's basically your go-to guy for big cover-ups. And he said that, I called him up and I said, Mr. Corley, can you tell me what kind of tests you're doing on the steel to determine if there's been any explosions associated with the steel? And he said, no, I don't know anything about that. He says, I'm not a metallurgist. He's a concrete guy. So why is a concrete guy examining the building where there's no concrete left? The people who were involved in the recovery and recycling of the stuff, the guys who were actually doing it, said there's only two things left. There's dust and steel. And you saw the dust went down the street. That dust disappeared. So at ground zero, all you're left with was steel. And here he is measuring a piece or trying to determine something. This man's passed away of cancer lately. And this is the man, also from the Chicago area originally. His parents got married in Palm Beach. And when they got married, their name was Jaffe. Then they changed their name to Jeffrey, kind of anglicized it, and moved to Arlington Heights, Illinois. His father was involved in like Rothschild-type finance. And this guy, he's an expert in very latest technology, nanothermite, DARPA-type stuff. They put him in charge of NIST at exactly the year, at the time they needed to craft this report to cover up the World Trade Center collapse. And he is the director of this report. He's the guy that spoke to Congress about what the report said. And this is the final report that completely ignores any evidence of explosions or molten iron, excuse me. Today, he again has also had a promotion. He's the executive director of something called the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California, formerly associated with Stanford University, obviously. And this is a nonprofit organization that does research and development for the US military. And one of the things they're very good at is creating nanothermite, nanocomposites of thermite, energetic nanocomposites, which is the new big thing in the military, believe me. Nanotechnology is going to change the way we live. Energetic nanocomposites change the whole nature of explosives and detonations, full stop. And see, when 9/11 happened, it was complete cutting edge. This was cutting edge technology. So most people couldn't even fathom it. Even today, when I talk about thermite, nanothermite, my detractors will say, oh, Mr. Bollyn, thermite is an incendiary, not an explosive. Well, we're talking about two different things. Thermite is indeed an incendiary. Nanothermite is an explosive. And their energetic nanocomposites are developed at Stanford Research by this Israeli man here on the right side, Yigal Dov Blum. He's the director and project manager of their Chemical Science and Technology Laboratory since 1984, where novel energetic materials and nanocomposite materials are developed. This is an energetic nanocomposite. This is what was found in the dust of the World Trade Center. It's a bilayered material. The top layer is the thermetic layer. The gray layer is basically iron-rich and organic. So that when the top layer detonates, when the burning layer, when the heat is created from the thermitic reaction, then instantaneously gas is presented. Gas is created. And that's what creates an explosion. An explosion is when gas is created so fast that you have this explosive effect. And that's what makes it an explosive. These are photographs of it. These are the chips that were found in the dust by Stephen Jones in Brigham Young University with some other scientists. And when they took these little chips, at first they thought they were paint because the dust had been analyzed. When they took these little chips and heated them up to 430 degrees Celsius, these detonated. They detonated with a boom. And what they created were tiny droplets of molten iron, which is what you get. So this is called an active thermetic material. The paper is called The Discovery of Active Thermetic Material in the Dust of the World Trade Center. And it's 25 pages, and it's very easy to read. It's very easy to understand. You don't have to be a scientist. And this is an example. This is from the Department of Defense. And it shows the top 4 bars represent nanothermites. And what these bars represent is the energy potential of these materials by gram or by volume. And as you can see, the metal oxidizers, the aluminum thermic reactions at the top yield much more energy per gram or per volume than these explosives at the bottom. The bottom four things are high explosives like TNT. And what you have to understand is that the smaller you make these things, the more powerful they are. And this is what seems to have created the dust, the pulverized the World Trade Center. There were 4-inch thick concrete floors, 220 of them. Each one was the size of 1 acre. They were all pulverized. And the pans, the steel pans that held those, were also disappeared. Now, some of you may have heard of something called Judy Wood. And Judy Wood is a person who came out in 2010 with a book about the destruction. She calls this the dustification. Now, if you read her book, you will see that her premise rests on one important thing. That's not true. She says that the destruction of the World Trade Center was a cold event. As I hope you've understood from the material I've shown you, it was anything but cold. It was rather extremely hot. Extremely hot. Now, if you imagine on the 81st floor, when you had that molten iron falling off the South Tower, the poor people who were trapped above that level were literally being cooked alive. Because that molten iron is at least 1,500 degrees Celsius. So that heat would go up through the vents, through the elevator shafts, and the poor people who were on the 83rd, 84th, 85th, all the way up to 110, they were literally being cooked alive, which is why they were standing at the window, standing at the edges, and that 250 of them jumped to their death. Because they said to themselves, better I jump to my death and end it now than be cooked like a chicken in this oven. And that's why I wrote an article called 9/11, An American Holocaust. Because a Holocaust is a large-scale destruction of human life in fire. And this is an American Holocaust. 2,700 people died in those towers. Most of them were trapped in those floors above the crash zone. They were unable to get down. If you were down below the crash zone, you could just take the stairwells. You're down the elevators, or stairwells mostly. But if you were above that, you couldn't get out. You were just trapped. And they were sacrificed. And the doors to the roof were locked. Like the Iroquois theater disaster, or these theater disasters we had in the 1920s and 30s in this country, when exit doors were locked. They used to lock people in the theaters. And when the fire burned, they couldn't get out. Same thing here. Why is Mr. Silverstein not asked, why were the doors to the lock, and what was the evacuation plan, Mr. Silverstein? What was the evacuation plan? This is the judge, Alvin K. Hellerstein, who oversaw all the 9/11 cases, but most importantly, he oversaw the 9/11 tort litigation. He's a New York judge in Manhattan. He's an Orthodox Jewish fellow. And what's important here is that his son is a lawyer in Israel. His son went to Israel, I think, in the year 2000. His son was a lawyer for an Israeli law firm which represented the key defendant in the trial of the 9/11 tort litigation that his father was overseeing in New York. That is a conflict of interest. But as much as I talked and wrote about it and presented evidence, the New York papers would not pick it up, obviously. But here's his son, Joseph Hellerstein. That's the law firm he works for. That's the company they represent. And that's a Rothschild company. It's called Kuckerman. And they own ICTS. ICTS was the company based in Holland that oversaw airport security in Boston and Newark and Dallas and other places. But they own a company called Huntley USA, which did the passenger screening on 9/11. Which is why they were involved in the tort litigation. Because the 96 families that held out, they wanted to know how these guys got on the airplane. How did these characters get on the plane through the passenger screening that was provided by this Israeli company? Well, what Alvin K. Hellerstein did is that he sent the company home. He unilaterally dismissed this company from the process, saying, you're just the parent company. I don't see why you should be here. And of course, there was no trial. The 96 families were all taken down. Originally, there were 3,000 families, basically, and those families were paid off by the man at the top, Kevin Feinberg, who dished out money. Okay, and when you sign on the dotted line, you give up any ability to sue the government or in any way, shape, or form. You basically take the money and say, okay, it's over for me. But there were 96 families who did not want to do that. 96 families wanted to know what happened that day. And they were dealt with by Sheila Birnbaum. Now, what's important to understand here about Kenneth Feinberg and Sheila Birnbaum is that they're very closely tied to the state of Israel. The one thing that all of these characters I showed you, all of them, they are devoted Zionists of a particular type. They're not just Zionists. They are supporters of the Likud party that is now running Israel. They are very closely associated with the leadership of the state of Israel. So you ask yourself, if all of these people who are involved in the cover-up and in the ideation and in the setting up of the crime, if all of these people are Israelis or Zionists, why are they covering it up? Why are they covering it up? Are they trying to protect Osama bin Laden? Are they trying to protect Saudi Arabia? Are they trying to protect the Illuminati? What? Well, it makes sense. It makes sense that they're trying to cover up a crime for the Zionist Israelis who carried out the crime, and that this crime is of that nature. And as mayor of New York with Ehud Barak in Israel, here he's very close to Mr. Netanyahu. Now what's interesting here is Netanyahu and Larry Silverstein were very close. And they had weekly conversations every Sunday afternoon in the years prior to 9/11. What were they talking about? Here's Mr. Netanyahu visiting New York with the mayor, and he's being shown the memorial that's being built. Mr. Netanyahu knew all about it because it was built by an Israeli. This man is the architect of the memorial area in the world ground zero. He's the son of the former ambassador to the United States, Israeli ambassador to the United States, Moshe Erad. These people are all members of the same group. You see, there's a network here, and they all have the same characteristics: affinity and connection to the state of Israel. Here's Mr. Silverstein when he received the keys, July 24th, 2001. That's when this Zionist leader of New York, former chairman of the United Jewish Appeal, he received the contract for the World Trade Center. He received the ownership, the lease, the 99-year lease. First thing he did is he increased the rents 40%, then insured future profits on the buildings, and insured them against any terrorist attack. So when the catastrophe befell the World Trade Center, he received double indemnity. He received indemnity for both attacks. Well, how did he get the towers? He got them through Lou Eisenberg. Lou Eisenberg was the executive of the Port Authority of New York. There were negotiations. The other key player that would have gotten them were not a realty, walked away from negotiations, and they gave the World Trade Center lease to Mr. Silverstein. Now, these two men belong to the same Jewish charity. As I said, Silverstein was the former national chairman of the board of the UJA Federation of New York there. Lou Eisenberg was on the board of planning from the same organization. So they share this bond, the Zionist bond that you don't see. Here, again, two very key Zionists in New York City, Larry Silverstein and the former mayor, Bloomberg. Here's Mr. Silverstein's partner. He's an Israeli. He's an Israeli commander named Frank Lowy. He owned the retail space. He owned the mall that was between the two towers underground. These are the two characters that got it. And this is Ronald Lauder. This is the man that privatized the World Trade Center in the beginning, that got the people of New York to understand that Governor Pataki is going to privatize certain properties, and they're going to privatize the World Trade Center. So the whole plan, Ronald Lauder is very closely tied to the Israeli Mossad. He has a school in Israel in his name at Mossad University, which is called the IDC in Herzliya, Israel. Now we're just about done here. Here's, again, Ehud Olmert and Mr. Netanyahu. As I said, Mr. Olmert was in New York City on 9/11. And on 9/11, a 747, LL 747, was allowed to leave New York City when other planes weren't allowed to go anywhere. It flew full from New York City to Tel Aviv, allowed under the U.S. Secretary of Defense. Defense officials took command of the plane and let it go. And here he came 10 days later, though. He shows up in New York, and he's talking to Mr. Giuliani, and he never admitted, he never said, well, I was here like the day before. I was here on September 10th. Why? Why was he in New York City on the September 10th and September 11th, and why has it been kept secret from the American people? This is the end of the program, basically. So from this catastrophe, from this devastation, from this shock and awe that we've gone through, they have brought us the war on terror. And this war on terror is supposed to go on for decades. Now, what I want you to understand is that the seminal event of the war on terror itself was a fraud. 9/11, we've been hoaxed, we've been tricked. And therefore, the war on terror itself is part of the same fraud. We've been deceived about this. And when you understand it's a deception, I compare it to like little Toto in the Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz. When Toto pulls the screen back, pulls the curtain back, and Dorothy and the crow, the scarecrow, they see that there's a wizard back there. He's just making machinations. He's just controlling things to deceive the whole world. And that's exactly what we are. We are being deceived. We have been deceived for years about 9/11 and the war on terror. And when you understand that it's all a deception, you lose your fear. You realize we're being lied to by a very small group of powerful people. The war on terror is not what it's claimed, what they say it is, and we're being lied to. So it's like you defang the monster when you understand that it's all a deception. Just like the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, when they realized that it was all deception, they realized they got back into their proper selves and realized that they were never missing anything at all. We're not missing anything at all. We're just deceived. Our whole nation's deceived. So you have a growing movement across the country of people who want 9/11 truth, and they see that the 9/11 truth is part and parcel of the whole deception that we're going through. We've never been, I don't think in this country, we've never been so deceived as we are today. And it causes a lot of people to lose their smile, and to lose their innocence, and to lose their joie de vivre. We're not happy anymore. Americans are not confident. We're not happy. We're poorer, and we're spiritually and emotionally in much worse shape than we were in 2000. But it's only because of deception. And so, the flag is upside down, but the youth of this country and the people of all ages are realizing that unless we can undeceive ourselves, and undeceive our families and our friends, and undeceive a critical mass of people in this country that we've been lied to, unless that happens, we will be enslaved to the war agenda. And that's what we cannot allow to happen. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Phil.